The radio crackled to life at 0547 hours. An American LRRP team, 8 men from the 101st Airborne Division, was requesting immediate link-up with an Australian SAS patrol operating 3 kilometers to their north. Intelligence suggested a high-value target, a Viet Cong battalion commander, moving through the area. Standard procedure dictated cooperation between Allied forces. The American team leader's voice carried the confidence of superior numbers and firepower. "We can pin him down if you drive him north. Easy hop, in and out by nightfall." The Australian patrol commander, a sergeant with 2 Vietnam tours and a Borneo campaign under his belt, listened to the transmission in silence. His patrol consisted of 5 men. They had been in the jungle for 11 days without speaking a word aloud. They moved at 100 meters per hour. They smelled like the jungle itself because they had not used soap, deodorant, or any chemical product for 3 weeks. They wore sandals cut from old tires that left tracks indistinguishable from Viet Cong footprints. His response was 2 words: "Negative. Continue." The American commander came back immediately, confusion evident in his voice. "Say again?" "We have positive ID on a priority target. This is a golden opportunity." The Australian sergeant's reply would be remembered, repeated, and eventually classified in after-action reports that would not be declassified for decades. "Too many Americans. You'll get yourselves killed and compromise our operation. We're going silent." He switched off the radio. 6 hours later, the American patrol walked into an ambush. 4 men died in the first 30 seconds. The survivors called for extraction under heavy fire, requiring helicopter gunships and artillery support that announced American presence to every enemy force within 10 kilometers. The Viet Cong battalion commander the Americans had been tracking disappeared into the jungle, alerted by the noise of the firefight. The Australian patrol, operating 2 kilometers away, heard everything. They remained motionless, invisible, silent. 3 days later, they located the same Viet Cong commander. They eliminated him and his security detail without firing a shot. Using claymore mines positioned along a trail the Australians had been watching for 72 hours. They left no trace of their presence. The enemy never knew what killed their commander or who had done it. This was not an isolated incident. This was the fundamental difference between how Australians and Americans fought the Vietnam War. And it explains why, despite officially being allies, Australian SAS operators increasingly refused to conduct joint patrols with American forces. The reasons went far deeper than tactical preference. They touched on survival, on philosophy, on fundamentally different understandings of what jungle warfare actually required. You are about to discover why Australian special operators who worked alongside American SEALs and special forces at the institutional level would go to extraordinary lengths to avoid patrolling with conventional American forces. Why American commanders complained that Australians were not aggressive enough, while Viet Cong documents explicitly instructed fighters to avoid Australian areas of operation. Why the most elite American operators sought out Australian training, while Australian patrol commanders submitted formal requests to be excused from joint operations. The statistics tell part of the story. Australian SAS patrols in Vietnam achieved kill ratios approaching 30-1. They conducted nearly 1,200 combat patrols over 5 years, with 6 deaths from enemy action and 28 wounded. American forces in similar roles averaged casualty rates 10 to 15 times higher. But statistics cannot explain the philosophy. To understand that, we must examine what happened when these 2 Allied forces attempted to operate together in the Vietnamese jungle. The first major joint operation between Australian SAS and American conventional forces took place in September 1967. Operation Santa Fe was designed to target Viet Cong strongholds in the Nui Mai Tao Mountains, a limestone massif northeast of the Australian base at Nui Dat. American planning called for a battalion-sized sweep and clear operation. 2 companies from the 173rd Airborne Brigade would move through the area in a coordinated advance, supported by artillery and helicopter gunships. Australian contribution would be a single SAS patrol, providing reconnaissance ahead of the main force. The Australian patrol commander reviewed the operational plan and immediately identified problems. American forces would insert by helicopter at first light, announce to every enemy scout within 5 kilometers. They would move in company strength, requiring them to use existing trails where ambushes could be prepared. They would communicate by radio using standard frequencies that Viet Cong signals intelligence had been monitoring for months. They expected to cover 8 kilometers per day, a speed that guaranteed they would be heard long before they could see any enemy. The Australian sergeant raised these concerns at the pre-operation briefing. The American battalion commander's response would be quoted in Australian after-action reports for years afterward. "Sergeant, we appreciate your reconnaissance work, but when it comes to combat operations, I think 2 companies of American Airborne have the situation well in hand. Your job is to find them. Our job is to kill them." The operation proceeded as planned. American helicopters inserted at dawn, the distinctive whop-whop-whop of Huey rotors echoing across the mountains. The companies formed up and began their advance. The Australian patrol, which had walked into position over 3 days and had been observing the target area for 48 hours, watched from concealment 400 meters away. Within 2 hours, the American advance had walked past 3 prepared Viet Cong ambush sites without detecting them. The enemy simply waited in their fighting positions as the Americans passed, noting numbers, weapons, and direction of movement. The Viet Cong commander, observing from a position the Australians had identified 2 days earlier, made no move to engage. He was waiting for something specific. It came at 1420 hours. The American companies stopped for a scheduled break. Soldiers broke out rations, lit cigarettes, began talking at normal conversational volume. Some removed their helmets. One squad set up a portable radio and tuned in to Armed Forces radio. The sound of American music drifted through the jungle. The Australian patrol, observing this through binoculars from their concealed position, watched as Viet Cong scouts moved to within 50 meters of the American perimeter without being detected. The enemy counted exact numbers, noted the positions of radio antennas that identified command elements, and withdrew to report. The ambush would not be triggered here. The Viet Cong commander was waiting for the Americans to move into a specific kill zone another kilometer ahead, where terrain would prevent effective helicopter support. The Australian patrol commander faced a decision. He could break radio silence to warn the Americans, compromising his own position and the intelligence his patrol had gathered over 3 days of silent observation. Or he could maintain operational security and watch Allied soldiers walk into a prepared ambush. He chose a middle path. He transmitted a brief encoded message to Australian headquarters at Nui Dat, reporting enemy positions and probable ambush location. Australian headquarters relayed this to American command. The American battalion commander received the intelligence and dismissed it. His exact words, recorded in the radio log, were, Australian reports are overly cautious. We have air support on station and artillery pre-registered. We are proceeding with the operation as planned." 40 minutes later, the lead American company entered the kill zone. The Viet Cong opened fire with machine guns, RPGs, and small arms from 3 sides. The Americans immediately returned fire and called for support. Artillery rounds began impacting within 8 minutes. Helicopter gunships arrived within 12. The jungle erupted in explosions, automatic weapons fire, and the screams of wounded men. The firefight lasted 3 hours. American casualties were 7 killed and 19 wounded. Viet Cong losses were estimated at 12 to 15, though no bodies were recovered because the enemy withdrew through prepared escape routes before artillery could seal them off. The entire enemy battalion disappeared into the mountains, scattering into small groups that would reassemble days later in a different location. The Australian patrol observed all of this from their position. They made no radio transmissions during the firefight. They did not move. When American helicopters swept the area looking for enemy forces, the Australians remained invisible in their camouflaged positions, making no attempt to signal or identify themselves. They understood that helicopter crews, pumped full of adrenaline and looking for targets, might fire first and identify later. After the Americans withdrew that evening, the Australian patrol remained in position. They spent the next 36 hours documenting enemy movement through the area, tracking the reassembly of Viet Cong forces and mapping the trail networks the enemy used for withdrawal. This intelligence would prove invaluable in future operations, but the Australian Patrol Commander's after-action report included a notation that would echo through Australian military circles. Request future operations be conducted independent of U.S. conventional forces. American operational methods compromise stealth operations and increase risk to Australian personnel. This was not an isolated opinion. Similar reports were filtering up through Australian chain of command from multiple SAS patrols that had attempted joint operations with American forces. The problems identified were consistent across operations and environments. American forces moved too fast, made too much noise, used too much firepower, and relied too heavily on technology. These methods worked for American operational doctrine, which emphasized finding the enemy, fixing them in position, and destroying them with overwhelming firepower. But they were fundamentally incompatible with Australian reconnaissance methodology. The issue came to a head in early 1968 when an American Special Forces captain requested a joint patrol with an Australian SAS team operating near the Cambodian border. This was different from working with conventional forces. American Special Forces, the Green Berets, were elite operators who theoretically shared the Australian emphasis on stealth and patience. The Australian Task Force commander approved the request, seeing it as an opportunity to improve Allied cooperation at the Special Operations level. The patrol consisted of 3 Australians and 3 Americans. The mission was a 5-day reconnaissance patrol to observe a suspected Viet Cong supply route. Pre-operation planning revealed immediate differences in approach. The Americans wanted to insert by helicopter under cover of darkness, a technique called night infiltration that American Special Forces had refined. The Australians argued for a ground insertion, walking in from 10 kilometers away over 2 days. The compromise was a helicopter insertion, but at a landing zone 5 kilometers from the target area, rather than the 500 meters the Americans initially proposed. The differences continued during the patrol itself. The Americans carried standard rucksacks loaded with 30 kilograms of equipment, including radios, batteries, ammunition, rations, medical supplies, and demolition charges. The Australians carried 22 kilograms in custom-modified packs that distributed weight differently and made no sound when moving. The Americans wore standard jungle fatigues with chemical insect repellent applied to exposed skin. The Australians wore modified uniforms with all metal removed or taped, and they used no insect repellent because the chemical smell could be detected from hundreds of meters downwind. The patrol moved toward the target area using what the Americans called tactical movement, covering approximately 2 kilometers per day. The Australians considered this dangerously fast, but accepted the compromise. On the second day, the patrol detected enemy activity. Fresh tracks indicated a Viet Cong squad had passed through the area within the previous 6 hours. The Americans wanted to follow the tracks, arguing that rapid pursuit might allow them to make contact. The Australians argued for establishing an observation position and waiting for the enemy to return along what was clearly a habitual route. The American captain made the decision to pursue. He was the senior officer, and this was technically his patrol. The Australians complied, but the Australian sergeant pulled his 2 men aside for a brief whispered conference. In Vietnamese jungle, 3 men can disappear where 6 cannot. 3 men can move in complete silence where 6 will inevitably make noise. The Australians had already made their assessment. This patrol was compromised, and the smart move was separation. But separation would mean abandoning Allied soldiers in enemy territory, something the Australians would not do. They continued with the patrol, following the Viet Cong tracks deeper into the jungle. The trail led to a small clearing that showed signs of recent occupation. Boot prints, discarded ration packaging, disturbed vegetation. The Americans set up a hasty ambush position, expecting the enemy to return. They waited for 3 hours. During that time, the Australian sergeant observed details that disturbed him. The clearing was too obvious. The trail approaching it was too well defined. The signs of occupation were visible from 30 meters away, which meant they were meant to be seen. This was not a rest halt. This was bait. He whispered his concerns to the American captain. The response was polite but dismissive. "Sergeant, I've run 50 patrols in this AO. I know what I'm looking at." The Australians remained silent but alert, watching the jungle with the intensity of men who knew they were being set up. The ambush came at 16:40 hours, but it was not the Americans ambushing the Viet Cong. It was the Viet Cong ambushing the Americans, springing a trap they had prepared hours earlier when their scouts detected the American patrol following their deliberately obvious trail. The enemy had circled around and set up in positions that covered the entire clearing from 3 sides. The first burst of automatic weapons fire killed 1 American instantly and wounded another. The remaining American took cover behind a fallen log and returned fire. The Australians reacted differently. Rather than return fire from their ambushed position, they moved laterally through the jungle using the noise of the firefight as cover. Their objective was not to win a gunfight. It was to survive and, if possible, break the ambush by attacking from an unexpected angle. The Australian sergeant and 1 trooper moved 40 meters through dense vegetation in under 3 minutes, making no sound, despite moving at speeds that should have been impossible. They positioned themselves perpendicular to the enemy ambush line and waited, not firing, just observing. The 3rd Australian remained with the Americans, pulling the wounded man to better cover. The Viet Cong ambush team consisted of 7 fighters with 2 RPD light machine guns and AK-47s. They were concentrating fire on the American position where the surviving Americans were shooting back, expending ammunition at a rate that would leave them dry within minutes. The Viet Cong were in no hurry. They knew the Americans could not call for helicopter support this late in the day, and artillery would be ineffective in the dense jungle terrain. This would be settled with small arms, and the enemy had superior positioning. The Australian sergeant made his move. Instead of engaging with gunfire, he signaled to his trooper, and both men threw fragmentation grenades in a precise sequence. The grenades were not aimed at the enemy positions. They were aimed behind the enemy, at their withdrawal route. The explosions came in rapid succession, 4 grenades in 4 seconds, cutting off the enemy escape path and creating panic in the Viet Cong ambush line. In the confusion, the Australians opened fire with short, controlled bursts from their shortened rifles. They were not trying to kill all the enemy. They were breaking the ambush by making it untenable. The Viet Cong, caught between the American position in front and Australian fire from the flank, broke contact and withdrew, exactly as the Australians predicted. The enemy faded into the jungle in under 30 seconds, leaving behind their wounded and 1 dead. The patrol had survived. The wounded American was still alive, though he needed immediate evacuation. The Australian sergeant called for extraction using his radio, speaking in the clipped brevity of men who know every transmission is a risk. A helicopter arrived after nightfall, guided in by infrared strobe that only the pilots could see. The patrol was extracted. The operation was classified as a tactical success. The American captain's after-action report praised Australian combat effectiveness and recommended future joint operations. The Australian sergeant's report was different. It noted that the patrol had been compromised by American movement techniques, had pursued an obvious deception, and had walked into a prepared ambush that could have been avoided with more cautious tactics. His conclusion was direct. Joint patrols with U.S. conventional or special forces increase operational risk without corresponding tactical benefit. Australian methods are fundamentally incompatible with American operational tempo and fire discipline. Recommend Australian patrols operate independently. This recommendation began moving up the Australian chain of command. It was not unique. Similar assessments were coming from multiple sources. The pattern was clear. When Australians operated alone, they achieved excellent results with minimal casualties. When they operated with Americans, results were mixed and casualties increased. The problem was not American courage or capability. American soldiers were brave, well-trained, and equipped with the best technology available. The problem was philosophical. American military doctrine in Vietnam was built on overwhelming firepower, rapid mobility, and technological superiority. These advantages had won World War II and would have won a conventional war in Vietnam. But Vietnam was not a conventional war. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army had studied American tactics for years. They knew Americans relied on helicopter mobility, which meant Americans would only be found near helicopter landing zones. They knew Americans used massive firepower, which meant Americans would break contact and call in airstrikes rather than pursue through difficult terrain. They knew Americans measured success in body counts, which meant they could trade casualties for time, disappearing after each engagement to fight again later. Against such an enemy, American doctrine produced predictable results: high enemy body counts, heavy use of ammunition and ordnance, frequent helicopter operations, and steady American casualties from ambushes, mines, and booby traps. The war had no front lines, no territory that stayed captured, no strategic points that, once taken, changed the course of the conflict. It was attrition warfare, and attrition favored the side willing to absorb casualties indefinitely. Australian doctrine had evolved from different experiences. In Malaya, Australian forces had fought a successful counterinsurgency campaign against communist guerrillas in the 1950s. They learned that jungle warfare required patience, stealth, and winning the support of local populations. In Borneo, Australian SAS had conducted cross-border operations against Indonesian infiltrators, learning that small patrols moving silently could accomplish what large operations could not. When Australians arrived in Vietnam, they brought these lessons with them. They did not try to hold territory. They tried to dominate it psychologically, making enemy forces afraid to move in areas where Australians operated. They did not measure success in body counts. They measured it in intelligence gathered, enemy movements disrupted, and psychological pressure applied. They did not rely on firepower to win engagements. They relied on not being detected in the first place. This philosophy manifested in specific tactical techniques that seemed bizarre or even cowardly to American observers unfamiliar with their rationale. Australian patrols moved at 100 to 200 meters per hour, a pace so slow it seemed operationally absurd. But at that speed, they could stop after each movement and listen for 4 or 5 minutes, processing every sound the jungle produced. They could step on roots and stones rather than soft earth, leaving no tracks. They could test the air for smells that indicated enemy presence, cooking fires, cigarette smoke, the distinctive odor of fermented fish sauce in Vietnamese rations. Australian soldiers stopped using soap, shampoo, deodorant, and toothpaste weeks before patrol insertion. They ate local food to change their body chemistry. Some Australian patrols included Aboriginal trackers, whose ability to read disturbed vegetation and detect human presence bordered on the supernatural. These men could determine from a footprint how long ago it had been made, whether the person who made it was carrying weight, whether they were alert or fatigued. They could smell a Vietnamese soldier from 400 meters downwind. When Americans first observed these techniques, many dismissed them as primitive or unnecessary. Modern technology could provide intelligence without soldiers smelling like unwashed vagrants. Electronic sensors could detect movement. Infrared cameras could spot heat signatures. Radio intercepts could track enemy communications. Why waste time with tracking techniques from the 19th century? The answer revealed itself in results. Electronic sensors could be avoided by anyone who knew where they were placed. Infrared cameras could not penetrate jungle canopy. Radio intercepts worked only if the enemy used radios, and Viet Cong couriers moved messages without electronics. But a patient patrol that smelled like the jungle, moved like a shadow, and read terrain like a book could gather intelligence that no technology could provide. The philosophical differences extended to combat itself. American doctrine emphasized immediate and overwhelming response to contact. If a patrol encountered enemy forces, they would fix them in position with small arms fire, call for artillery and air support, and destroy them with superior firepower. This made tactical sense in many situations. It saved American lives by bringing overwhelming force to bear, but it had predictable consequences. Every engagement became a set-piece battle that announced American presence to every enemy force in the area. Helicopter gunships, artillery fire, and tactical airstrikes were loud, visible, and impossible to mistake. After each engagement, the area would be flooded with American follow-up forces, which meant the area was effectively denied to Americans for days afterward because the enemy knew they were coming. Australian doctrine was different. Australian patrols were trained to avoid contact unless they had overwhelming tactical advantage. If contact occurred, their first response was to break it and disappear, not to stand and fight. This seemed counterintuitive to Americans raised on aggressive warrior ethos, but it reflected a different calculation. A firefight that killed 5 enemy soldiers but revealed the patrol's position was a tactical defeat because it compromised future operations. An enemy force that passed within meters of a concealed patrol without detecting it was a tactical victory because it meant the patrol could continue gathering intelligence. When Australians did initiate combat, it was not random. It was calculated to achieve specific psychological effects. A Viet Cong courier team walking down a trail would be allowed to pass if the tactical situation was wrong, but if the situation was right, they would walk into a claymore ambush that killed them instantly and silently. The Australian patrol would remain in position, watching the trail. Hours later, a search team sent to investigate the missing couriers would find the bodies arranged in a specific way, sitting upright, eyes open, weapons across their laps, a playing card tucked into each collar. The psychological effect on the Viet Cong was devastating. They could not defend against an enemy they could not detect. They could not call for support against an ambush that lasted 4 seconds. They could not explain to their commanders how an entire courier team had died without anyone hearing gunshots. Fear of Australian patrols spread through Viet Cong units operating in Phuoc Tuy province. Captured documents explicitly instructed soldiers to avoid areas where Australian SAS operated. American commanders observing these results had mixed reactions. Some recognized the effectiveness and tried to incorporate Australian techniques into American training. Others viewed Australian methods as incompatible with American operational tempo and strategic objectives. A few dismissed them as timid or overly cautious, failing to understand that aggression is not measured by noise but by results. The tension came to a crisis point in mid-1968 when an American brigade commander specifically requested Australian SAS support for a major operation in the Mae Tau Mountains. The operation would involve 3 American battalions conducting a multi-week sweep and clear. Australian SAS would provide reconnaissance ahead of the main force, identifying enemy positions and movements. The Australian Task Force commander agreed in principle but imposed conditions. Australian patrols would operate independently, not attached to American units. They would report through Australian chain of command, not directly to American headquarters. They would maintain operational autonomy, meaning they could decline American requests that they deemed tactically unsound. And most importantly, Australian patrols would not be required to support American operations that compromised their positions or methods. The American commander agreed to these terms, though with visible reluctance. He needed the intelligence Australian patrols could provide. The operation proceeded with 3 Australian patrols inserted into the mountains by helicopter, then walking to their positions over several days. The American battalions would follow a week later. What happened over the next 3 weeks revealed the fundamental incompatibility of the 2 approaches. Australian patrols, moving at their glacial pace, identified numerous enemy positions, trail networks, supply caches, and movement patterns. They reported this intelligence through Australian channels, which relayed it to American command. The intelligence was detailed, specific, and actionable. But American operations could not exploit it effectively. By the time American battalions moved into position to act on intelligence about enemy locations, the enemy had moved. The Americans were too loud, too obvious, too predictable. Viet Cong scouts detected American helicopter insertions from kilometers away. They heard American patrols moving through the jungle. They monitored American radio traffic. By the time American forces arrived at reported enemy positions, the enemy was gone. The Australian patrols watched this with increasing frustration. They had spent days in silent observation, gathering intelligence that should have been devastating to enemy operations. But that intelligence was being squandered by American methods that announced every move in advance. One Australian patrol commander reported watching an entire Viet Cong battalion withdraw from positions they had occupied for weeks, moving out 6 hours before American forces arrived. The enemy had not detected the Australian patrol 400 meters away. They had detected American helicopters inserting troops 8 kilometers distant. The operation achieved modest results. American forces made contact with enemy forces several times, inflicting casualties and disrupting enemy operations. But the strategic objective of destroying or dispersing the enemy battalion failed. The Viet Cong simply moved to another mountain range and resumed operations within days. The Australian patrols, having provided intelligence that could not be effectively exploited, were withdrawn. The Australian Task Force commander's assessment was direct. Joint operations between Australian SAS and American conventional forces were not productive. The fundamental differences in operational method were too great. Australian patrols produced better intelligence when operating alone. American forces achieved better results when they did not have to coordinate with Allied units that operated at different tempos and used different tactics. This assessment was not meant as criticism of American capability. It was recognition of incompatibility. American methods were optimized for American doctrine. Australian methods were optimized for Australian doctrine. Forcing them to work together compromised both without enhancing either. The policy that emerged was quiet but firm. Australian SAS would continue providing intelligence to American forces through liaison channels. Individual Australian personnel would continue serving as advisors and instructors to American Special Operations. Australian conventional forces would continue operating alongside American units in battalion-level operations, but Australian SAS patrols would operate independently, not as part of joint American-Australian operations. This policy was never officially announced. It simply became practice. When American commanders requested Australian SAS support, the requests were politely declined with explanations about operational commitments or tactical considerations. Australian patrols operated in their assigned areas. American forces operated in theirs. Intelligence was shared through proper channels, but the patrols themselves did not mix. The American Special Forces community understood this better than conventional commanders. Green Berets and later SEALs who worked with Australians recognized that Australian methods worked precisely because they were different from standard American practice. Some American special operators sought out opportunities to train with Australians, learning techniques that American doctrine did not teach. Navy SEAL Roger Hayden spent 10 days with an Australian SAS patrol in 1968. He later said he learned more about reconnaissance in those 10 days than in all his previous training combined. The Australians moved through the jungle without speaking, communicating through hand signals so subtle that Hayden missed most of them at first. They stopped frequently to listen, sometimes remaining completely motionless for 15 minutes while they processed sounds. They could identify individual animals by their calls, knowing which species would fall silent when humans approached. Hayden watched Australian trackers examine ground that looked completely undisturbed to him and determined that 2 men had passed through 8 hours earlier, both carrying weapons, one limping slightly. He watched Australians position themselves for an ambush, spending 6 hours in complete stillness, waiting for enemy movement they had predicted based on tracks and trail patterns. He watched them eliminate an enemy patrol without firing a shot, using claymore mines positioned precisely where the Australians knew the enemy would walk. When Hayden returned to his SEAL team, he tried to implement some Australian techniques. He found immediate resistance. American operational tempo did not allow for 100-meter-per-hour movement. American commanders expected patrols to cover ground, to find the enemy, to make contact. Sitting motionless for hours watching a trail seemed like wasted time when patrols could be actively searching. The aggressive American warrior ethos valued action over patience, movement over stillness. But some American units did adapt. MAC, VSOG reconnaissance teams operating in highly classified cross-border operations adopted many Australian techniques. They moved slowly, used minimal radio communication, avoided contact unless absolutely necessary, and emphasized intelligence gathering over combat engagement. Their casualty rates were significantly lower than conventional LRRP teams, and their intelligence production was higher. Delta Force, formed in the late 1970s, incorporated Australian patrol techniques into its training program. The founders of Delta had studied Australian operations in Vietnam and recognized that patience and stealth often achieved more than speed and firepower. Modern American Special Operations doctrine includes many techniques that Australian SAS pioneered in Vietnam, but in 1968 these lessons were still being learned, and the learning process was painful, measured in casualties that might have been prevented if American forces had been more willing to adopt methods that seemed counterintuitive to their doctrine. The fundamental problem was not tactical, it was cultural. American military culture valued aggression, speed, and overwhelming force. Australian military culture, shaped by Malaya and Borneo, valued patience, stealth, and psychological dominance. Neither approach was wrong. They were simply optimized for different operational environments and strategic objectives. American methods were designed to win conventional wars against conventional enemies. Australian methods were designed for counterinsurgency against guerrilla forces. Vietnam was a counterinsurgency war being fought with conventional methods, and that mismatch produced the frustrations that defined the American experience. The Australians recognized this earlier than most Americans because they had recent experience with successful counterinsurgency in Malaya. They knew what worked against guerrilla forces operating among civilian populations in jungle terrain. They knew that technology and firepower could not substitute for patience and cultural understanding. They knew that winning required not just defeating enemy forces, but convincing the population that the government could provide security. When Australian forces withdrew from Vietnam in 1971, they left behind a record that American military analysts would study for decades. The Australian task force had operated in Phuoc Toi province with approximately 8,000 troops at peak strength. They secured a province of 1,500 square kilometers, cleared it of main force Viet Cong units, and established government control in areas that had been enemy strongholds for 20 years. They did this with 521 total deaths over 6 years, a casualty rate significantly lower than American forces operating in similar environments. The Australian SAS component of this operation was particularly remarkable. 600 men rotated through 3 squadrons over 5 years. They conducted 1,200 patrols, observed thousands of enemy movements, killed approximately 600 enemy soldiers, and suffered 6 combat deaths. Their kill ratio was among the highest of any unit in the war, but more importantly, their psychological impact on enemy morale was devastating. Viet Cong units in Phuoc Toi province became increasingly reluctant to operate in areas where Australian SAS patrols were known to work. This success came not from superior weapons or technology, but from superior method. The Australians understood that jungle warfare was about invisibility, patience, and psychological pressure. They understood that the side that controlled the night controlled the jungle. They understood that fear was as powerful a weapon as any explosive. American forces eventually learned some of these lessons, but the learning curve was steep and expensive. By the time American Special Operations Doctrine fully incorporated the techniques Australians had been using since 1966, American involvement in Vietnam was ending. The institutional knowledge that should have been gained from Australian experience was diluted by rotation policies that brought new units to Vietnam every year, forcing each to learn the same lessons independently. The phrase, "too many Americans," became shorthand in Australian military circles for a specific problem: the incompatibility between methods that required silence and patience versus methods that relied on firepower and speed. It was not a criticism of American soldiers who fought with courage and skill. It was recognition that 2 Allied armies, fighting the same enemy in the same terrain, had developed fundamentally different approaches that could not easily be reconciled. When Australian patrol commanders declined to participate in joint operations, they were not refusing to support Allied forces. They were protecting their men from compromised operations that increased risk without enhancing effectiveness. They were preserving the operational methods that made their patrols effective, and they were making a hard calculation that every commander must make: whether cooperation with allies was worth the cost if that cooperation reduced your own effectiveness and endangered your own troops. The American military never officially acknowledged the policy of separate operations. Australian military never officially announced it. But in practice, after mid-1968, Australian SAS patrols operated independently of American conventional forces. The intelligence they gathered was shared. The areas they secured benefited Allied operations, but the patrols themselves remained distinctly Australian in method, tempo, and philosophy. This arrangement worked. Australian and American forces both contributed to Allied operations in their own ways, using their own methods. The Australians provided detailed intelligence from patient observation. The Americans provided rapid reaction forces that could exploit that intelligence when tactical conditions allowed. The relationship was productive precisely because it recognized and respected the differences rather than trying to force incompatible methods to work together. The legacy of this separation is still visible in modern special operations doctrine. Australian and American special forces maintain close relationships, train together regularly, and deploy together on operations worldwide, but they maintain distinct operational cultures that reflect the lessons learned in Vietnam. Australian special operators still emphasize patience, stealth, and long-duration patrols. American special operators have incorporated these techniques while maintaining their own emphasis on rapid, decisive action. The phrase, "too many Americans," has faded from use, but the principle it represented remains relevant. In any coalition operation, allies must recognize when their methods are compatible and when they are not. Forcing cooperation that compromises effectiveness helps no one. Sometimes the best support is independence, allowing each force to operate according to its strengths while sharing the intelligence and resources that enhance everyone's operations. The Australian SAS soldiers who refused joint patrols in Vietnam were not being difficult or uncooperative. They were being professional. They knew their methods worked, they knew what compromised those methods, and they made the hard decision to prioritize effectiveness over appearances. Their American counterparts, when they understood the reasoning, generally respected the decision. The ones who did not understand complained about Australian caution or reluctance to engage. But the ones who worked most closely with Australians, the Special Forces advisors and SEAL operators who learned Australian techniques, understood perfectly. In the end, the Vietnam War taught both American and Australian forces valuable lessons about jungle warfare, counterinsurgency, and coalition operations. The Australians learned that their methods, developed in Malaya and Borneo, were effective in Vietnam. The Americans learned that technological superiority and overwhelming firepower could not substitute for patience and stealth in guerrilla warfare, and both learned that even the closest allies sometimes serve each other best by operating independently, sharing intelligence and support, while maintaining the operational autonomy that allows each to fight according to their strengths. The radio call that began this story, "Too many Americans," was not an insult. It was a tactical assessment. The Australian patrol commander was not dismissing American capability. He was recognizing American method and concluding correctly that mixing that method with his own would compromise both. His decision to go silent, to refuse the joint operation, to operate independently, was not cowardice or ego. It was professionalism, and it was the kind of hard decision that separates effective special operations from disastrous compromises. The Viet Cong called Australian SAS operators Ma Rung, jungle ghosts. The name was earned through methods that seemed strange or primitive to conventional military thinking, but were devastatingly effective in practice. Those methods required silence, patience, and independence. They could not survive in an environment of helicopter insertions, radio chatter, and rapid movement. So, when American forces offered partnership, Australian patrols politely declined, not because they doubted American courage or capability, but because they knew exactly what their methods required. And what they required was fewer Americans, not more.